The magic walking stick, John Buchan. When Bill came back for long leave that autumn half, he had before him a complex program of entertainment. Thomas, the keeper, whom he revered more than anyone else in the world, was to take him in the afternoon to try for a duck in the big marsh called Aylmore. In the evening Halloween would be celebrated in the nursery with his small brother Peter, and he would be permitted to sit up after dinner till 10 o'clock. Next day, which was Sunday, would be devoted to wandering about with Peter, hearing from him all the appetizing home news, and pouring into his greedy ears the gossip of the foreign world of school. On Monday morning, after a walk with the dogs, he was to motor to London, lunch with Aunt Alice, go to a conjuring show, and then, after a noble tea, return to school in time for lock-up. It seemed to Bill all that could be desired in the way of excitement. But he did not know just how exciting that long leave was destined to be. The first shadow of a cloud appeared after luncheon, when he had changed into knickerbockers, and Peter and the dogs were waiting at the gun-room door. Bill could not find his own proper stick. It was a long hazel staff, given him by the second stalker in a Scotch deer forest the year before, a staff rather taller than Bill, of glossy hazel, with a shapely polished crook, and without a ferrule, like all stalking sticks. He hunted for it high and low, but it could not be found. Without it in his hand, Bill felt that an expedition lacked something vital, and he was not prepared to take instead one of his father's shooting sticks, as Groves, the butler, recommended. Nor would he accept a nubbly cane proffered by Peter. Feeling a little aggrieved and imperfectly equipped, he rushed out to join Thomas. He would cut himself an ash plant in the first hedge, but as the two ambled down the lane which led to Aylmore, they came on an old man sitting under a hornbeam. He was a funny little wizened old man, in a shabby long green overcoat, which had once been black, and he wore on his head the oldest and tallest and greenest bowler hat that ever graced a human head. Thomas walked on as if he did not see him, and Chip, the spaniel, and Sean, the Irish setter, at the sight of him dropped their tails between their legs, and remembered an engagement a long way off. But Bill stopped, for he saw that the old man had a bundle under his arm, a bundle of ancient umbrellas and queer ragged sticks. The old man smiled at him, and he had very bright eyes. He seemed to know what was wanted, for he at once took from his bundle a stick. You would not have said that it was the kind of stick Bill was looking for. It was short, and heavy, and made of some dark foreign wood, and instead of a crook it had a handle shaped like a crescent, cut out of some white substance which was neither bone nor ivory. Yet Bill, as soon as he saw it, felt that it was the one stick in the world for him. How much? He asked. 1 farthing, said the old man, and his voice squeaked like a winter wind in a chimney. Now a farthing is not a common coin, but Bill happened to have one, a gift from Peter on his arrival that day, along with a brass cannon, 5 empty cartridges, a broken microscope, and a badly printed brightly illustrated narrative called 2 Villains Foiled. But a farthing sounded too little, so Bill proffered one of his scanty shillings. I said 1 farthing, said the old man rather snappily. The small coin changed hands, and the little old wizened face seemed to light up with an elfish glee. "'Tis a fine stick, young sir," he squeaked, "a noble stick, when you gets used to the ways of it." Bill had to run to catch up Thomas, who was plodding along with the dogs, now returned from their engagement. "That's a queer chap, the old stick man, I mean," he said. "I ain't seen no old man, Master Bill," said Thomas. "What be 'e talkin' about, the fellow back there? I bought this stick of him." Thomas cast a puzzled glance at the stick. "That be a crafty stick, Master Bill," but he said no more, for Bill had shaken it playfully at the dogs. As soon as they saw it they set off to keep another engagement, this time, apparently, with a hare, and Thomas was yelling and whistling for 10 minutes before he brought them to heel. It was a soft grey afternoon, and Bill was stationed beside one of the deep dikes in the moor, well in cover of a thorn bush, while Thomas and the dogs went off on a long circuit to show themselves beyond the big mere, so that the duck might move in Bill's direction. It was rather cold, and very wet underfoot, for a lot of rain had fallen in the past week, and the mere, which was usually only a sedgy pond, had now grown to a great expanse of shallow floodwater. Bill began his vigil in high excitement. He drove his new stick into the ground, and used the handle as a seat, while he rested his gun in the orthodox way in the crook of his arm. It was a double-barreled, 16-bore, and Bill knew that he would be lucky if he got a duck with it, but a duck was to him a bird of mystery, true wild game, and he preferred the chance of one to the certainty of many rabbits. The minutes passed, the grey afternoon sky darkened towards twilight, but no duck came. Bill saw a wedge of geese high up in the sky and longed to salute them. Also he heard snipe, but could not locate them in the dim weather. Far away he thought he detected the purring noise which Thomas made to stir the duck, but no overhead beat of wings followed. Soon the mood of eager anticipation died away, and he grew bored and rather despondent. He scrambled up the bank of the dike and strained his eyes over the moor between the bare boughs of the thorn. He thought he saw duck moving. Yes, he was certain of it. They were coming from the direction of Thomas and the dogs. It was perfectly clear what was happening. There was far too much water on the moor, and the birds, instead of fighting across the mere to the boundary slopes, were simply settling on the flood. From the misty grey water came the rumour of many wildfowl. Bill came back to his wet stand grievously disappointed. He did not dare to leave it in case a flight did appear, but he had lost all hope. He tried to warm his feet by moving them up and down in the squelchy turf. His gun was now under his arm, and he was fiddling idly with the handle of the stick which was still embedded in earth. He made it revolve, and as it turned he said aloud, "I wish I was in the middle of the big flood." Then a remarkable thing happened. Bill was not conscious of any movement, but suddenly his surroundings were completely changed. He had still his gun under his left arm and the stick in his right hand, but instead of standing on wet turf he was up to the waist in water. And all around him were duck shovelers, pintail, mallard, teal, widgeon, pockard, tufted and bigger things that might be geese swimming or diving or just alighting from the air. In a second Bill realized that his wish had been granted. He was in the very middle of the flood water. He got a right and left at mallards, missing with his first barrel. Then the birds rose in alarm, and he shoved in fresh cartridges and fired wildly into the brown. His next two shots were at longer range, but he was certain that he had hit something. And then the duck vanished in the broom, and he was left alone with the grey waters running out to the dimness. He lifted up his voice and shouted wildly for Thomas and the dogs, and looked about him to retrieve what he had shot. He had got two anyhow, a mallard drake and a young teal, and he collected them. Presently he heard whistling and splashing, and Jip the spaniel appeared half swimming, half wading. Jip picked up a second mallard, and Bill left it at that. He thought he knew roughly where the deeper mere lay so as to avoid it, and with his 3 duck he started for where he believed Thomas to be. The water was often up to his armpits and once he was soused over his head, and it was a very wet, breathless and excited boy that presently confronted the astounded keeper. "Where in goodness ha' you been, Master Bill? Them ducks was tiggling out to the deep water and I was feared ye wouldn't get a shot. 3 on 'em, no less. My word, ye are ve punished 'em." "I was in the deep water," said Bill, but he explained no more, for it had just occurred to him that he couldn't. It was a boy not less puzzled than triumphant that returned to show his bag to his family, and at dinner he was so abstracted that his mother thought he was ill and sent him early to bed. Bill made no complaint, for he wanted to be alone to think things out. It was plain that a miracle had happened, and it must be connected with the stick. He had wished himself in the middle of the flood water. He remembered that clearly, and at the time he had been doing something to the stick. What was it? It had been stuck in the ground, and he had been playing with the handle. Yes, he had it. He had been turning it round when he uttered the wish. Bill's mind was better stored with fairy tales than with Latin and Greek, and he remembered many precedents. The stick was in the rack in the hall, and he had half a mind to slip downstairs and see if he could repeat the performance. But he reflected that he might be observed, and that this was a business demanding profound secrecy. So he resolutely composed himself to sleep. He had been allowed for a treat to have his old bed in the night nursery, next to Peter, and he realized that he must be up bright and early to frustrate that alert young inquirer. He woke before dawn, and at once put on socks and 5's shoes and a dressing gown, and tiptoed downstairs. He heard a housemaid moving in the direction of the dining room, and Groves opening the library shutters, but the hall was deserted. He groped in the rack and found the stick, struggled with the key of the garden door, and emerged into the foggy winter half-light. It was very cold, as he padded down the lawn to a retired half-moon of shrubbery beside the pond, and his shoes were soon soaked with hoarfrost. He shivered and drew his dressing gown around him, but he had decided what to do. In this kind of weather he wished to be warm. He planted his stick in the turf. "I want to be on the beach in the Solomon Islands," said Bill, and 3 times twisted the handle. In a second his eyes seemed to dazzle with excess of light and something beat on his body like a blast from an open furnace. He was standing on an expanse of blinding white sand at which a lazy blue sea was licking. Behind him at a distance, or perhaps 200 yards, was a belt of high green forest, out of which stuck a tall crest of palms. A hot wind was blowing and tossing the treetops, but it only crisped the sea. Bill gasped with joy to find his dream realized. He was in the far Pacific where he had always longed to be. But he was very hot, and could not endure the weight of winter pajamas and winter dressing gown. Also he longed to bathe in those inviting waters. So he shed everything and hopped gaily down to the tide's edge, leaving the stick still upright in the sand. The sea was as delicious as it looked, but Bill, though a good swimmer, kept near the edge for fear of sharks. He wallowed and splashed, with the fresh salt smell which he loved in his nostrils. Minutes passed rapidly, and he was just on the point of striking out for a little reef, when he cast a glance towards the shore. At the edge of the forest stood dark-skinned men, armed with spears. Bill scrambled to his feet with a fluttering heart, and as he rose the men moved forward. He was, perhaps, 50 yards from the stick, which cast its longer morning shadow on the sand, and they were 200 yards on the farther side. At all costs he must get there first. He sprang out of the sea, and as he ran he saw to his horror that the men also ran in great bounds, shouting and brandishing their spears. Those 50 yards seemed miles, but Bill won the race. No time to put on his clothes. He seized his dressing gown with one hand and the stick with the other, and as he twirled the handle a spear whizzed by his ear. "I want to be home," he gasped, and the next second he stood naked between the shrubbery and the pond, clutching his dressing gown. The Solomon Islands had got his 5's shoes and his pajamas. The cold of a November morning brought him quickly to his senses. He clothed his shivering body in his dressing gown and ran by devious paths to the house. Happily the gun-room door was unlocked, and he was able to ascend by way of empty passages and back stairs to the nursery floor. He did not, however, escape the eagle eye of Elsie, the nurse, who read a commination service over a boy who went out of doors imperfectly clad on such a morning. She prophesied pneumonia, and plumped him into a hot bath. Bill applied his tongue to the back of his hand. Yes. It tasted salt, and the salt smell was still in his nose. It had not been a dream. He hugged himself in the bath and made strange gurgling sounds of joy. Life had suddenly opened up for him in dazzling vistas of adventure. His conduct in church that morning was exemplary, for while Peter at his side had his usual Sunday attack of street Vitus's dance, Bill sat motionless as a mummy. On the way home his mother commented on it and observed that Lower Chapel seemed to have taught him how to behave. But his thoughts during the service had not been devotional. The stick lay beside him on the floor, and for a moment he had a wild notion of twisting it during the litany and disappearing for a few minutes to Kamskatka. Then prudence supervened. He must go very cautiously in this business, and court no questions. That afternoon he and Peter would seek a secluded spot and make experiments. He would take the stick back to school and hide it in his room. He had a qualm when he thought what a floater it would be if a lower boy appeared with it in public. For him no more hours of boredom. School would no longer be a place of exile, but a rapturous holiday. He would slip home now and then and see what was happening. He would go often to Glenmore. He would visit any spot in the globe which took his fancy. His imagination reeled at the prospect, and he cloaked his chortles of delight in a fervent amen. At luncheon it was decided that Peter and he should go for a walk together, and should join the others at a place called the Roman Camp. Let the boys have a chance of being alone, his father had said. This exactly suited Bill's book, and as they left the dining room he clutched his small brother. "Shrimp," he said in his ear, "you're going to have the afternoon of your life." It was a mild, grey day, with the leafless woods and the brown ploughlands lit by a pale November sun. Peter, as he trotted beside him, jerked out breathless inquiries about what Bill proposed to do. and was told to wait and see. Arrived at a clump of beeches which promised privacy, Bill first swore his brother to secrecy by the most awful oaths which he could imagine. "Put your arm round my waist and hang on to my belt," he told him. "I'm going to take you to have a look at Glenmore." "Don't be silly," said Peter. "That only happens in summer, and we haven't packed yet." "Shut up and hold tight," said Bill as he twirled the stick and spoke the necessary words. The boys were looking not at the smooth bowls of beeches, but at a little coppice of rowans and birches above the narrow glen of the hill burn. It was Glenmore in very truth. There was the strip of mossy lawn, the whitewashed gable end of the lodge. That to the left beside the walled garden was the smoking chimney of the keeper's cottage. The beyond the trees was the long lift of brown moorland and the blue top of Stobgarbar. To the boys Glenmore was the true home of the soul, but they had seen it only in the glory of late summer and early autumn. In its winter dress it seemed for a moment strange. Then the sight of an old collie waddling across the lawn gave the connecting link. "There's Watty," Peter gasped, and lifted up his voice in an excited summons. His brother promptly scratched him. "Don't be an ass, Shrimp," he said fiercely. "This is a secret, you fathead. This is magic. Nobody must know we are here. Come on and explore." For an hour, it must have been an hour, Bill calculated afterwards. But it seemed like 10 minutes the two visited their favorite haunts. They found the robber's cave in the glen where a raven nested, and the pool where Bill had caught his first pound trout, and the stretch in the river where their father that year had had the 30-pound salmon. There were no blackberries or crowberries in the woods, but there were many woodcock, and Bill had a shot with his catapult at a wicked old blackcock on a peat stack. Also they waylaid Watty, the collie, and induced him to make a third in the party. All their motions were as stealthy as an Indian's, and the climax of the adventure was reached when they climbed the garden wall and looked in at the window of the keeper's cottage. Tea was laid before a bright peat fire in the parlor, so Mrs. McCrae must be expecting company. It looked a very good tea, for there were scones and pancakes, and shortbread and currant loaf and heather honey. Both boys felt suddenly famished at the sight. "Mrs. McCrae always gives me a scone and honey," Peter bleated. "I'm hungry. I want one." So did Bill. His soul longed for food, but he kept hold of his prudence. "We daren't show ourselves," he whispered. "But, perhaps, we might pinch a scone. It wouldn't be stealing, for if Mrs. McCrae saw us she would say, 'Come away, laddies, and get a geely piece. I'll give you a back, Shrimp,' and in you get." The window was open, and Peter was hoisted through, falling with a bang on a patchwork rug. But he never reached the table, for at that moment the parlor door opened and someone entered. After that things happened fast. Peter, urged by Bill's anguished whisper, turned back to the window, and was hauled through by the scruff of the neck. A woman's voice was heard crying, "Mercy on us, it's the bairns," as the culprit started to the shelter of the gooseberry bushes. Billy realized that there was no safety in the garden, so he dragged Peter over the wall by the way they had come, thereby seriously damaging a pear tree. But they had been observed, and as they scrambled out of a rose bed, they heard cries and saw Mrs. McCrae appearing round the end of the wall, having come through the stable yard. Also a figure, which looked like Angus, the river gilly, was running from the same direction. There was nothing for it but to go. Bill seized Peter with one hand and the stick with the other, and spoke the words, with Angus not 6 yards away. As he looked once more at the familiar beech bowls, his ears were still full of the cries of an excited woman and the frenzied howling of Watty, the dog. The two boys, very warm and flustered and rather scratched about the hands and legs, confronted their father and mother and their sister, Barbara, who was 16 and very proud. "Hello, hello," they heard their father say. "I thought you'd be hiding somewhere hereabouts. You young rascals know how to take cover, for you seem to spring out of the ground. You look as if you'd been playing football. Better walk home with us and cool down." "Bless my soul, Peter, what's that you've got?" "It's bog myrtle." "Where on earth did you find it?" "I've never seen it before in Oxfordshire." Then Barbara raised a ladylike voice. "Oh, Mummy, look at the mess they've made of themselves. They've been among the brambles, for Peter has 2 holes in his stockings. Just look at Bill's hands." And she wrinkled her finical nose, and sniffed. Bill kept a diplomatic silence, and Peter, usually garrulous, did the same. for his small wrist was in his brother's savage clutch. That night, before Peter went to bed, he was compelled once more to swear solemn oaths, and Bill was so abstracted that his mother thought that he was sickening for some fell disease. He lay long awake, planning out the best way to use his marvelous new possession. His thoughts were still on the subject next morning, and to his family's amazement he made no protest when, to suit his mother's convenience, it was decided to start for London soon after breakfast, and the walk with the dogs was cancelled. He departed in high spirits, most unlike his usual leave-takings, and his last words to Peter were fierce exhortations to secrecy. All the way to London he was in a happy dream, and at luncheon he was so urbane that Aunt Alice, who had strong and unorthodox views about education, announced that in Bill's case, at any rate, the public school system seemed to answer, and gave him double her customary tip. Then came the conjuring show at the Grafton Hall. Bill in the past had had an inordinate appetite for such entertainments, and even in his new ecstasy he looked forward to this one. But at the door of the hall he had a shock. Hitherto he had kept close to his stick, but it was now necessary to give it up and receive a metal check for it. To his mother's surprise he protested hotly. "It won't do any harm," he pleaded. "It will stay beside me under the seat." But the rule was inexorable and he had to surrender it. "Don't be afraid, darling," his mother told him. "That funny new stick of yours won't be lost. The check is a receipt for it, and they are very careful." The show was not up to his expectations. What were all these disappearing donkeys and vanishing ladies compared to the performances he had lately staged? Bill was puffed up with a great pride. With the help of his stick he could make rings round this trumpery cleverness. He was the true magician. He wished that the thing would end, that he might feel the precious stick again in his hand. At the counter there was no sign of the man who had given him the check. Instead there was a youth who seemed to be new to the business, and who was very slow in returning the sticks and umbrellas. When it came to Bill's turn he was extra slow, and presently announced that he could find no number 229. Bill's mother, seeing his distress, intervened, and sent the wretched youth to look again, while other people were kept waiting, but he came back with the same story. There was no duplicate number 229, or any article to correspond to the check. After that he had to be allowed to attend to the others, and Bill, almost in tears, waited hysterically till the crowd had gone. Then there was a thorough search, and Bill and his mother were allowed to go behind the counter. But no number 229 could be found, and there were no sticks left, only 3 umbrellas. Bill was now patently in tears. "Never mind, darling," his mother said, "we must be off now, or you will be late for lockup. I promise that your father will come here tomorrow and clear up the whole business. Never fear, the stick will be found, but it is still lost." When Bill's father went there next day, and cross-examined the wretched youth, for he had once been a barrister, he extracted a curious story. If the walking stick was lost, so also was the keeper of the walking sticks, for the youth was only an assistant. The keeper, his name was Jukes, and he lived in Hammersmith, had not been seen since yesterday afternoon during the performance, and Mrs. Jukes had come round and made a scene last night, and that morning the police had been informed. Mr. Jukes, it appeared, was not a very pleasant character, and he had had too much beer at luncheon. When the audience had all gone in, he had expressed to his assistant his satiety of life. The youth's testimony ran as follows: Mr. Jukes, he was waving his arms something chronic and carrying on about how this was no billet for a man like him. He picks up a stick, and I thought he was going to hit me. "Percy, me lad," says he, "I'm fed up to the back teeth." He starts twisting the stick, and says he, "I wish to even I was out of air. After that I must have come over faint, for when I looks again, he adopted." Mr. Jukes' case is still a puzzle to Mrs. Jukes and the police, but Bill understands only too clearly what happened. Mr. Jukes and the stick have gone out of air, and whether it may be neither Bill nor I can guess, but he still lives in hope, and he wants me to broadcast this story in case the stick may have come back to earth. So let every boy and girl keep a sharp eye on shops where sticks are sold. The magic walking stick is not quite 4 feet long, and about 1.25 inches thick. It is made of a heavy dark red wood, rather like the West Indian purple heart. Its handle is in the shape of a crescent with the horns uppermost, made of some white substance which is neither bone nor ivory. If anyone sees such a stick, then Bill will give all his worldly wealth for news of it. Failing that, he would like information about the man who sold it to him. He is very old, small and wizened, but his eyes are the brightest you ever saw in a human head. He wears a shabby, greeny-black overcoat which reaches down to his heels, and a tall, greeny-black bowler hat. It is possible that the stick may have returned to him. So if you meet anyone like him, look sharply at his bundle, and if it is there and he is willing to sell, buy it, or you will regret it all your days. For this purpose it is wiser always to have a farthing in your pocket, for he won't give change,